is apropos. Well, the UN Special Envoy to Syria is calling for free and fair elections following the ousting of President Bashar al-Assad, adding that the international community was ready to support the country's new leaders. He also voiced hope that a political solution would be found for Kurdish-held areas. Well, years of civil war have left Syria heavily dependent on aid, deeply fragmented and desperate for justice and peace. Charlotte Hughes has the latest.
At the notorious Sednaya prison, north of Damascus, Syrians leaf through abandoned records. They're desperately seeking news of missing loved ones detained under the Assad regime. Among those calling for truth and justice after witnessing years of human rights violations is Hassan. His brother was imprisoned in 2019.
I went to Mazar Air Base yesterday. I went through the records and couldn't find anything. I looked in the hospitals and I didn't find anything. I came here to find a string of hope, but I found nothing.
UN investigators have been gathering proof of the regime's crimes for years. After thousands of photos of tortured detainees surfaced, the UN established the International, Impartial and Independent Mechanism in 2016. It centralises and shares evidence for use in legal proceedings. In the words of the organisation's leader, Bashar al-Assad's ouster changes the game in terms of access to evidence.
There is, however, the potential in this now accessible crime scene, or maybe I should say interlocking series of crime scenes. There is now the possibility of accessing evidence of the highest level of regime and allied crimes responsibility.
But preserving this information is not a straightforward task.
We've had reports and we've seen as well, right? Papers strewn all over the floor. People leaving with computers, hard drives burnt and smashed. We are also aware of reports, some of which we have confirmed, of individuals who have fled the jurisdiction.
The UN is now calling on Syria's new leaders to not disturb the evidence of crimes by seizing prisons. HTS leader Ahmed al-Shara, who has dropped his nom de guerre, Abu Mohammed al-Jalani, has insisted that torturers will not be granted amnesty.
We're joined now by war crimes investigator Janine Di Giovanni, award-winning writer and executive director of the Reckoning Project. It's an organisation dedicated to documenting war crimes and building cases for prosecution. Janine, thank you so much for being with us on the programme this evening. You have extensive experience in this area. You've investigated and documented a total of nearly 24 wars and genocides, investigated abuses on 4 different continents, and you've spent 7 years in Syria. Talk to us about what you found there.
Well, I think it's a really interesting time right now for international justice. If we look back at the genocides of the 1990s of Rwanda and Bosnia and where we are now, we're in a very different place. First of all, the investigations are carried out in a very different way, largely because we do have things like open source intelligence, which is satellite imagery, radio interception, so investigations can be much more clear. Now, Syria it was one of the most tragic wars I've covered because the level of cruelty of the Assad's prisons, of the torture, of the cracking down, the repression, the rape, the starvation used as a tool of war, chemical attacks on his own people, the list is endless. So going through those crimes and bringing those perpetrators to justice, including Assad, is going to be a real task. But what is possible is that, first of all, we have plenty of evidence. Syria was one of the most documented wars, largely because civilians had cell phones, they had iPhones. So in Aleppo, when the barrel bombs were dropping, people could rush out and take photographs of them. There were a lot of international journalists working there at the time. Amnesty was there, Human Rights Watch were there. Syrian investigators themselves were doing incredible jobs, even during the Assad regime. But what we have now is something similar to what happened in Germany in 1945 or Iraq, 2003. I wasn't born in 1945, but I was in Iraq in 2003 when Saddam fell. And what we had then was this extraordinary level of evidence of mass graves, of going into prisons. But in Syria, we were doing it all along, even during the Assad regime and from the other side, from the opposition side. I also think it's really important for Ahmed al-Sharaa to establish himself as a leader who believes in the rule of law. And he will need very much to attract international donors. So this is why, I mean, everyone is saying, will he go the way of ISIS? Will he become a jihadist? I believe no, because I believe he's first distanced himself a dozen years ago from that, but also he will need to get donors to rebuild Syria. In order to do that, there must be a strong rule of law within the country. Syrian courts have been basically under the Baathists for 50 years. They will need help, but there's many examples of what we could do.
And what about Bashar al-Assad himself? Will he ever face justice? As far as we know, he's currently in Moscow.
Yes. Look, I went through the Bosnian Wars, and everyone said Slobodan Milosevic would never, ever face justice. But what happened? Milosevic's government fell. A new government came in. They wanted to be part of the EU, and to do that, they made a deal to hand him over to The Hague. So in the same way, I work in Ukraine now with the Reckoning Project. We're a team of lawyers, investigators, OSINT, data analysts. And everyone says we'll never get Putin, but we do not know that. There could be a change of regime. There could be an entirely new government who have completely different views and want to see Putin in The Hague. In the same way with Assad, anything can happen. Also, we have to look at the different international justice mechanisms. So what might happen in Syria, there might be something like what happened in Sierra Leone, which was a brutal war in West Africa that I also reported back in, it fell in 2000. The court that was set up at the request of the government of Sierra Leone, because it was a new government that came in, and backed by the United Nations, went on for 10 years, going after the perpetrators that had committed terrible, terrible crimes against the Sierra Leonean people. Same thing with Cambodia. So there could be a mixture of domestic Syrian courts, because the Syrian justice system, it has to go to the Syrian people. It should be in Syria. It should be with the Syrian people, but it needs help, whether that will be the UN, hybrid courts, or whether even it will be an international court, the International Criminal Court. But in that case, the new government in Syria would have to call for it, because at the moment they're not signed up. So there's many, many different avenues. And don't forget that back in 2022, the very first Syrian war crimes tribunal took place in Germany against a man for crimes against humanity, a Syrian individual, and it took place in Germany in a third-party country. So there are, we're looking at this in a way overwhelmingly, because the amount of criminality, 400,000 people died, 200,000 more were in prisons, 130,000 are still missing. 4,000 of the people in prison were kids. So there's a tremendous amount of work we have to do.
And when it comes to speaking to some of those people who were in those prisons, how do you record that kind of testimony in such a way that it will be admissible in court if there is to be a further trial? So
one of the reasons we founded the Reckoning Project was that when I was a war reporter, I had witnessed many atrocities, and I had very good notes, but a journalist's notes are not the same as testimonies that prosecutors need to build their cases. There need to be different standards used. For instance, if you're interviewing victims of sexual violence, you need to have a very strict protocol, including usually someone, a psychologist or a member of law enforcement with you. Interviewing children is extremely precarious. You need to be very careful. We just finished a year-long project with in Ukraine, tracing the 19,000 Ukrainian children that have been stolen and taken to Russia for forcible adoption. Now, working on those kind of testimonies is a very different way than how I would have worked as a journalist years ago. So, I mean, it has to be airtight so that the prosecutors will not throw them out of court. But having said that, in Syria, there's been a tremendous amount of civil society that have worked throughout the war, who have been so courageous, including the Caesar photographs, which came out from a Assad prison official who smuggled some of the most terrible images I've ever seen of what was happening inside the prison. So we have a lot of evidence to work with. It's just how will the system be put back together? And as for Assad, again, nothing is impossible. And he will be judged. He's certainly being judged now in the court of public opinion, which is very important. And hopefully he will be judged in the courts of law.
And you yourself, you're going back to Syria in the new year?
I am.
Yeah.
I don't want to say fortunate, but I did work on the Assad side for several long trips, which was very rare. In those days, no journalists were given visas. The only ones who got them were journalists who were either Russian or who were clearly on the side of the regime. I was obviously not, but they did let me in for several trips where I gathered a huge amount of information. Then I was thrown out after witnessing a massacre in Daraa, writing about it, and I was told never to come back, threatened, told I would be put in prison. So then I began going through the other side, which was through Turkey to Syria, working with the opposition groups, mainly in Aleppo. And one of the things I worked very strongly and closely on was the bombing of hospitals. This is something that the Russians who came into the game in Syria in 2015, it was their terrible specialty. And it's something that Vladimir Putin is doing again in Ukraine. It's part of what we call Putin's gruesome playbook. And Syria, at one point, there were so few hospitals left. There was only, I remember being in one triage, and there were kids dying of things that they could have been saved from, respiratory illnesses, but because there was no medical supplies, and because the doctors had mainly been killed, the cruelty of it was just staggering. Syria, during the Assad reign, was one of the most brutal and cruel and vicious places. So it's really exhilarating, but also we're looking at it with great euphoria, but also trepidation, because we want it to go right. We want justice to be served for the Syrian people who endured so much.
Janine, unfortunately, we'll have to leave it there for now. We could speak to you for hours, I feel. Thank you so much for being with us this evening. It's war crimes investigator Janine Di Giovanni. Hopefully I'm pronouncing your name correctly there. She's also Executive Director of the Reckoning Project. Well, that is it from us for now. Up next.